All right, team, we got everybody back on. So that was one of Travis's finest there, coming up with some crazy videos during the pandemic crisis. Good stuff. All right, so coming up next, we've got some serious brain power. We got Doc Springer coming to us from Harvard, and she's been a contributor to multiple different publications, to Military Times, done a lot of work with various people, and also recently retired Master Sergeant Jakimick. He's done a lot of stuff with mental health issues as well. So we've got some great folks here. They're going to talk to us. So really like to welcome them both right now.
Thank you. Good to be here. Chris, are you on as well?
Yeah, I'm here. It's great. It's a nice day out here in Las Vegas. So good to see you all and be connected with airmen again today on Armed Forces Day.
Yeah, I want to know if that video is unclassified and shareable. And if it is, can somebody please send it to me? Because that was really funny. Really enjoyed that. Needed that humor today. Should we jump in, or are there any more preambles, Senior Master Sergeant?
The floor is yours. We thank you for your time, and we want to turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to quickly introduce myself, and then I'm actually going to have Chris take point on this, Master Sergeant Jakimick. Chris and I have known each other for a few years now. We've been doing a lot of work around postvention and grief and loss, as well as decreasing stigma around getting mental health treatment. And then recently, Chris and I have been through an experience together where he's really been able to have some innovative treatments for trauma symptoms that may be of benefit to some of you, that may be good to know about. But what we're really wanting to talk about today is a little bit of that story, but also I want to jump in and talk about coping with this situation that was unprecedented, is unfolding now. I've talked to veterans of all generations, and they don't always say that it was the most traumatic thing they've ever been through, but everybody seems to agree that there's been nothing like this ever before, where the world as we know it just suddenly stops. With so many major adjustments and micro adjustments every day, all the time. So I'm going to have Chris walk point, and then I'm going to jump in a little bit later. So Chris, why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, Doc, and thanks for the warm introduction. So for my fellow airmen on this chat, I retired on the 1st of February. I'm an airman like y'all. I spent time, most of my duty was out here at Nellis as an active duty member. So for my defenders in the room and my communicators, I'm one of y'all. But then I took some time and I was an Air Force First Sergeant for 4.5 years, and I spent a stint as a executive assistant to the command chief. One thing about me is I'm a distinguished graduate of every level of enlisted PME, from ALS all the way up to Senior Non-Commissioned Officer Academy. 2-time Commandant Award recipient and 2-time nominee for the 12 Outstanding Airmen of the Year program. But with that, that's just stuff on paper. I'm here and my focus is taking care of myself and taking care of my people. But what we're going through now is what Doc Springer explains is the world kind of stopped and we really don't know. We've never seen this. It's kind of been unprecedented. But there was something else unprecedented when I was a young 20-year-old airman. So I'm sure we've got some trainees in the room or something like, folks, hey, I was a young airman. I was an E3 at the time. I was getting ready to go. And I just returned from my first deployment. I deployed to Kuwait in that time. I got out of tech school as a young defender. I was motivated. They sent me off to Al Jaber Air Base, Kuwait with the Mark 19 grenade launcher, and I was ready to rock. During that time frame, we got to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the liberation of Kuwait from Iraq. And so I got to do some personal security details for some very high-level folks such as George Bush, Margaret Thatcher, Colin Powell, and General Schwarzkopf themselves as a young 20-year-old airman. But what shocked me on that deployment is I would lose my mother about 5 days before I would come home from that deployment as a young 20-year-old airman. There I was at the end of my tour, the end of my mission, getting ready to come home and celebrate with my family, and I'd go through the most profound loss I had in my life at that point. I'd lose my maternal grandfather 2 months later to stomach cancer. The year was 2001. This was June. I didn't know what was coming next and around that corner. But here I am as a 20-year-old Security Forces Airmen. And on September 11th, 2001, the world changed completely for every airman that was serving. Now, as a defender, we didn't know what was going on at the time. I remember that morning clearly. I was leaving my apartment. I was on my motorcycle. I had earbuds in and I was listening to Howard Stern on the radio, driving and getting ready for guard mount. And they said, what, plane hit one of the towers, and we couldn't believe that. And by the time guard mount broke, our entire world changed. But what did that leave us with at the time was anxiety. What's going on in this world? Where do I fit in this mission? The whole world changed completely for the entire Air Force after that one moment, as it's changing today. We don't know. When we go to Iraq and Afghanistan and these other places we're deploying to, it's a little like coronavirus. We don't know where the threat is coming from. We know we need to protect ourselves and stay vigilant. But everywhere we move or we went on a deployment after that, it was the anxiety of what's next. This hypervigilance, protecting myself. Is the person around me protecting themselves? Is that piece of trash over there a threat? Is that person in plain clothes a threat? And so when we see this, when we go out into our communities, there's always this heightened threat awareness. And that's what I feel now. And it's kind of replicated what I felt on September 11th and September 12th as a young airman. And so I can understand as we're coming into the Air Force now, your world has changed. Whether you're a defender, whether you're a supply NCO, whether you work in the base hospital, whether you're in the contingency response group out there getting ready to go, you're like, what's my next mission and how can I serve? But how can I protect myself at the same time while protecting others? Doc, do you have some comments on that?
I do. Yeah, I think that's just wonderful how you're able to kind of use your story as somebody going through 9/11 to talk about that shift where the world as we knew it is not the world we inhabit suddenly. I would say that people feel strain and anxiety goes viral when our basic priorities are in conflict. And I get the sense from talking with warriors that people don't even really understand why this is hitting us so hard. So I would add to the picture that we have these basic priorities that we aren't really aware of until something changes. And one of our basic priorities is we earn our keep. We have a role to play and we do that job. But another basic priority, basic primal priority for many of us is you protect those in your family, you protect those around you. And as a warrior and as a service member, that instinct is very strong. So now we have this invisible enemy, like you said, Chris, and this life or death stakes, 24-hour vigilance, don't quite know what shape it will take or how we can get it. And these basic priorities can be in conflict because the call to duty can make us have anxiety about what if I get the virus, or what if I bring it home to somebody I love, or a vulnerable elderly person in my life, or my child. No matter what they tell us about risk, it's still just a consideration for many of us. Could I pass it on to my kids? So that is one of these unspoken stresses that I just wanted to make very real and tangible for us. I think also anxiety goes viral when we lose our role, our identity, and our purpose. And that is very parallel to the work that I do with transition. And you're in transition, Chris. So I have a few other observations, but I'm going to ping pong it back to you to talk about that piece about transitional trauma and the transition that all of us are thrust into when the jobs that we had, the roles, the relationships that give our lives meaning are suddenly changed.
Thanks, Doc. And that's been a definite difficulty. So for all the airmen on the line, I retired on the 1st of February. I lost my first post-military job on the 31st of March. So to transition out of the service right into a pandemic like this has been quite challenging. And maybe some of you have seen the inverse. You're joining the Air Force at this time. You're going through a massive life transition to where you're discovering who you are, or you're getting ready to head off to basic training. And I'm going to tell you, basic training that you're about to head to is not the basic training that any of us else have experienced. Yesterday we graduated the first basic training class out of Keesler since 1968. So some of you may be heading to a place to where they're still figuring it out down there at Keesler Air Force Base. We're in unprecedented times for the Air Force. And the funny thing is where we're gaining trauma in this is our mission is to stay home for some people. That is unlike the military. Our mission is usually to come together and solve the problems, go downrange, deploy, pack those pallets, send our gear out, respond to these emergencies. Now, some of you may be doing that. You know, I look at Travis Air Force Base's mission as you have a massive medical center out there. Last time I was up there, I was talking to the CRG, and it's you've got these missions that kind of come together. You've got that humanitarian contingency response group mission, and then you've got the massive medical center. So some of you may actually be putting in more duty hours than you ever expected. You're on the front lines. You are that first responder. You are at risk all the time. I would say that you are the trigger puller right now. You're kicking in doors by putting that swab in somebody's nose and seeing if they're a positive carrier, if they're symptomatic for that. So the mindset has shifted. If you're a medical professional in that, or somebody that supports that mission, you are in active combat against an enemy that is unseen. But Doc brings up another point as well too. And one thing in my experience, so I was the first sergeant for a pararescue unit, and I got to see a lot of things there, and it was very great to be a part of that mission set. And where some of my other learning come from is being a steward, being a first sergeant for these fine, silent professionals. But at the end of my tour, there was very difficult. But they gave me a gift that kind of resonates with me during this time and how we can view the general public. And I'm going to tie it to a lesson is, if you're a fan of ancient Greek mythology, you may know the story of Odysseus and the ship when he sailed between Scylla and Charybdis. And that's where I feel society is at right now. You're either going to go towards Scylla, this six-headed dragon monster, and you're going to sacrifice the entire crew by opening up the economy too early and rushing out there just because it's the shorter path. Or you go to the whirlpool of Charybdis and you save the crew, and maybe you only lose 4 because it's a more path route. There are some people that would rather face Scylla head on to face the six-headed dragon and crash their entire crew for the betterment of themselves as just Odysseus. Now that is just thinking in the selfish thinking. But Odysseus took the right advice, is he took the path. And the path he took is we all row in the same direction. We take this paddle. And when a crew is united, if you're not using a paddle and paddling the same way in the same direction, your boat spins and your boat gets in trouble and you do not move forward and you do not stay the course. So maybe this time in this pandemic is we follow Odysseus' path and we go towards Scylla and we split the difference between these two beasts that are going to take us out. And we follow that course home, and then we find the next normal, and our crew is safe, and for the betterment of society, we have more crew members that'll continue to paddle on. So the paddle signifies that. This was given to me by the 58th Rescue Squadron, actually on my 37th birthday. And we paddled forward, and for some of you may know the call sign of pararescue is the guardian angel. And by golly, after that weekend that I left this unit, because I went from the 58th Rescue Squadron to the 99th Medical Group here at Nellis Air Force Base on the weekend of 29 September 2017. So I left my unit, I had my cell phone, I turned some duties over to a new first sergeant at the time, and I got ready to go from 130 airmen to 1,300 airmen in one weekend. So I was teetering between units. But what happened out here on that Sunday in Vegas with my crew is we all knew we needed to come the next direction. Because like coronavirus, we didn't know what was coming next. And unfortunately, that's when a gunman decided to perch up in Mandalay Bay and go in and really do some harm to our city. But I will tell you this, is we don't tell the story of the airmen that went in and paddled in the right direction to be able to save the lives of so many citizens like you guys are today, by giving that mission out there and focusing on that. Whether your mission is to stay, to self-isolate, whether your mission is to get out there and generate sorties to bring supplies elsewhere around the world to fight this fight, whether your mission is to integrate into the medical center there, as you're following that mission and you're all paddling in the same direction. Doc, back to you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story that you use with Odysseus, and to illustrate just how inverted and flipped on its head things are right now. Let's go back to Odysseus for a minute. So for years, as a frontline provider to a caseload of hundreds of veterans and warriors, I would use the story of the Island of the Sirens. And I would use that story to illustrate the voice of anxiety. Now, the voice of anxiety is that quiet voice that whispers in your head that tries to control your behavior and tell you not to go there, not to do this. And if you listen to that commanding voice, it will shrink your life down to nothing. And so the Island of the Sirens was really used in the therapy that I did as a story to illustrate why we need to not listen to that voice, because it is a path towards destruction and sort of moral and spiritual and psychological death if we have our lives hemmed in by anxiety. We end up in a very small foxhole, not doing anything much of value. Now, here is the interesting thing. So, as Chris, you rightly pointed out, our frontline responders, our warriors in the COVID crisis, may be the people that are called to the front lines doing the swabbing and really putting themselves at risk. And they may be struggling with long hours, trauma from having their fellow airmen become ill potentially, the fear about bringing that home to their families, having to make decisions with limited time, information, and maybe without all of the equipment that we now know that we need to supply. Just like when we went into Iraq, people at first did not have body armor. The Humvees were not up armored. So there is a fog of war, and we learn from that, and then we should protect those who support us. But at the same time, I don't know who has the harder challenge, because as you so astutely pointed out, Chris, warriors are people of action. And it's way harder for warriors to do nothing than to do something really hard. So the sacrifice of those who are told to simply shelter in place and wait for news and do nothing is a trauma for many of us, is a sacrifice for many of us. And what's difficult about it is that for years, if you were thinking, don't listen to the voice of anxiety and don't behave in the ways that anxiety suggests, now, just like the video we saw from just before we came on, there are all these new rules that totally change the way we operate with others. Stay back, don't come near, wash your hands, keep your distance. All of these things that keep us hemmed in, and that is very hard for people of action. So I would just say that that is a definite challenge, and I don't know that we need to say who has it harder, but both are harder. Now, what will happen is that we will feel when our basic priorities are in conflict, or when we are told to sit in our foxhole and just wait, we eventually will tend to feel a helpless frustration. And for many of us, that can become helpless rage. And if we look behind the rage, what we will find is any number of things. We will find fear. We will find all other kinds of anxieties. We will find guilt. We will find shame, and we will find grief. And I really want to talk about grief because Master Sergeant Joachimic is just somebody who knows at such a depth about grief from his expertise and his lived experience that I really want to ask you, Chris, if you'll give the gift of sharing some of what you've learned about what healthy grieving is and how we can walk through that valley of grief, not just about the obvious things, about someone who died, but about the loss of our roles, our relationships, the changes that we face every day in a million little adjustments.
Definitely, Doc. So I'll be very vulnerable and transparent here. Right before that, the 1 October shooting here in Las Vegas on the 4th of July of 2017, I lost one of my first airmen, technical sergeant. Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's all right. We got you.
Yeah. He passed away from cancer unexpectedly on the 4th of July. And then on the 25th of July that same year, I would lose my brother, Lance Corporal Adam Jakovic, to suicide while I was attending the Senior NCO Academy. I'd just given a speech on one of my favorite military leaders, Scipio Africanus. He's the famous Roman who was actually able to defeat Hannibal. So I remember the details close enough. And as a first sergeant, you know, I had the ultimate responsibility of when airmen were in crisis, they would come to me, and I would be that source to be able to find that help, whatever the help looked like to them, whether it was to the chaplain, whether it was to mental health, whether it was to the MFLAC or something like that. And then the difficulties that I had after that is that the guilt and the grief that built up for me is I could be there for my own airmen, but I couldn't be there for my own family. And so I launched into this, and maybe a little bit in blind ignorance, is I was so bought into the mission because I worked with a bunch of snake eaters there in a pararescue unit. I was like, okay, let me go, let me handle my business with my family at home, and let me get back. So get back before this whole incident. And then I get back to my unit about 3 weeks after we take care of my brother and have his memorial ceremony. And then my unit, we respond to the hurricanes in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico along with that as well too. So it's like I didn't even give myself time to grieve at first. So I would share this lesson with you. Is like, if you've gone through grief, is like, take that time. There is no timeline to grief. Yeah, a lot of folks out there will say, oh, there's this linear, you go through the stages and everything. No, you know what it looks like? It looks like a spaghetti bowl with sauce all over it, where it comes back and it's waves. It's like the ocean that's out there. And sometimes that ocean, that wave turns into a tsunami and just knocks you off course and really kind of floods the landscape, destroys the trees around it. But then how do you pick yourself back up? Well, first you have to get stable. Like, there has to be some stabilization that's done, like, to really go through this, like the signs of grief that are out there. And it's not going to be linear. And then you really need to dive into that grief work, like understanding the why, understanding what's going on, and changing it. Is instead of the guilt that's associated with it, is take that choice out of your own head. Because for me, when I lost my brother, it wasn't about my choice. You know, I thought I could have stopped him, but I didn't know if I could. And once you answer your own question on the why, then I do every day, you know, I do my best to honor his dash. Because it doesn't matter the day he was born. It doesn't matter the day he passed. What mattered was the mark that was in between, that short little dash that was there. So I live my life to the fullest to honor him. And there's some things that I've done, and usually these are my 5 M's, as I call them. And they're Motrin, 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 and Motrin. Just kidding. Anyway, yeah, I was going to lead in a joke. If you look at an MRE, if you ever seen one, you know, it looks like Kanye talking to President Trump on the one by a fireside chat. Take a look at it. It'll make you laugh. It looks like Kanye talking to the president. But what I got into, a lot of this was my mindset. Is getting out of this catastrophizing and this demonizing mindset that was there, that then, you know, to put it frankly with Game of Thrones, the night is dark and full of terror. Well, it really isn't. And to change that, to bring in this growth mindset, or the brought in and built. So I flipped my mindset to gratitude and growth, and not focusing on the negative, but what was my gratitude and growth after that? The second M is movement. I physically moved my body, like whether it's 20 minutes of an activity or anything like that. And that's what I bide myself on, is it's the martial arts. Is I found a lot of healing through combat sports. I found a lot of healing through cycling, you know, taekwondo, push-ups and everything, competing in Spartan races. We have an organization out here in Las Vegas that all of you can kind of join too. And I'll send out the link to the hosts here, but it's called Merging Vets and Players. And it takes this transition, you know, of us and former professional athletes that join in on it. And we talk about this transition stress of this identity. And one of the most profound things I ever heard from Doc Springer actually comes from her partner, Jason Roccaroni. He said in this transition process it's not the uniform that makes you great. You made the uniform great. So when we get in huddles in their emerging vets and players, we understand this. And there's this beautiful synergy and harmony that comes together with former pro athletes and combat veterans. Matter of fact, you can join us virtually on it. You know, I get to work out with Randy Couture every week of MMA fame. I get to work out with him, his coaches. We had the NFL commissioner, Roger Goodell, on there. Nate Boyer is on the chat, if you know who Nate Boyer is, you know, and you may up there in that area, because he's the one who told Colin Kaepernick to take a knee in protest. But then we also have Kirstie Ennis, a wounded combat Marine veteran who's so inspiring, it's not even funny. And when we get together in this tribe, it's all about that mindset through movement of your body. The other M is mindfulness. And I started to get into breath work and started to get into these practices that really healed myself. And the one that I found that was most profound was the Wim Hof Method. You could go into it, but what it is it really kind of gets you on there. And if we change our breath and the way we breathe or the way we sit in that, if you just breathe in for 6 seconds, hold at the top for 6 seconds, breathe out for 6 seconds, and slow down your cycle, you'll take some of that anxiety away, because you'll be able to bring your mind back into control. So you'll notice it. If your heart rate is usually up, your breath rate is usually up. If you're breathing better and the slower breathing, the more relaxed you are. So I found these methods to kind of heal myself. And for me, that was the internal martial arts. So right now in this, where we're kind of in self-isolation, if you can't go outside, why don't you go inside and influence your brain and your thoughts and your actions and decisions, your behaviors, by a simple thing of breath work?
I would validate what you're saying about how when you lose someone or you have a traumatic grief, a lot of us, the first thing we go to is a feeling of guilt. And I think that comes from a place of love, you know, that you and I have had strong ties to TAPS, Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, a wonderful organization based in Washington, D.C. I was their former senior director of suicide prevention and postvention initiatives. And Chris has been a TAPS ambassador and doing some really cool things with fitness and honoring his brother Adam and those fallen to suicide. I think what we say at TAPS is that we grieve because we love. And so the guilt that we feel often comes from that place of, what did I miss? What could I have seen? What could I have done differently? But also, you know, I would balance that picture with, it comes from love. And at the same time, warriors and those who serve are professionally good at compartmentalizing their hidden pain. And so it's also a myth that if we are good enough in terms of our perception of the signs, that we will always be able to stop someone who we lose to suicide. That there are many things that are outside of our control, and we do the best we can, but the other half of the equation is that people need to be able to say, I'm not okay. And they need to exercise the love and the trust they have with the people that they care about, whether they're in their home front tribe or their fellow airmen, to say, I'm not okay, and get the help that they need. One of the challenges and also blessings is that people who serve in the military essentially have two families. And there's a lot of guilt in that too. You know, Chris, when I think about you experiencing this feeling of, can I take care of my own family? You know, the mission, you have two families, you know, and the people in the mission are your family too. So there will always be, as part of your sacrifice in service, a tension, a moral tension or something of that nature between how much you can support both of your families. And I tell you, I feel that every single day. I was online yesterday with a group of leadership in SOCOM doing an hour-and-a-half presentation, 45 minutes into it. My 6-year-old daughter comes in and says, I can't get on Zoom for her class. And she was supposed to be on there like 15 minutes earlier. And so it just, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I never would have done this 2 months ago. I felt so guilty about it. But balancing those two things really has become very challenging. So what do we do? You know, Chris gave you some really practical things, and I just want to add some thoughts to that as well. one of the most practical things that I've been suggesting to people recently is to simply take out a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, and then on one side, write things I can control. And on the other side, things that are outside of my control. And catalog the things that you feel are totally outside of your control, which you're going to need to cope with in emotional ways. And then on the side of things that are inside of your control, those things should form the basis for some kind of plan of action. Now, sometimes when you do that, and you get a little space from it, you realize that some of those things that you thought were totally outside of your control might not be. That some of those things might be creatively influenced if you pulled in the right people or if you thought in lateral ways. So you can go back to that list then and see if there's anything that's really important to you that you want to influence and add some of those things to your plan of action. Chris, I want to talk with you about, or have you share with the group about what you've been doing with cycling and honoring the memory of Adam and those fallen to suicide, and how that has really put your values into action. Even in the quarantine, you know, I get Facebook posts where you've done some crazy, not literally, but like to me, like some super fitness activity, biking from Las Vegas to like the East Coast in a day and back. Something, you know, it seems that way to me. So tell us about what you're doing with that.
Yeah. So the month of May here, there's another, and it's kind of a military related organization called Carry the Load. Is they generally will do in the month of May, they'll do a ruck march across the entire country. So this year, hey, we're not be able to participate in the ruck march for this, but it's really bringing the true meaning of Memorial Day back to America. It's not all about barbecues, boating, and sales at Home Depot or Bed Bath and Beyond. It's like that's what it's there for, is that and you know, really being out there and honoring. So my goal for the year was 2,020 miles on my road bike. Well, I've hit 700 this month alone. And I get out there and I dedicate every ride to somebody that we've lost and somebody that I'm personally connected to. I'll ask a sibling or I'll ask a parent beforehand. So today, luckily, you know, with being Armed Forces Day, I biked from my house to my last duty station, which is Nellis Air Force Base. It's about a 13-mile bike ride from where I live at. Went on and took a photo in front of the Thunderbirds for Cajun. Cajun was the Thunderbird pilot that we lost a couple of years ago when the Thunderbird had that accident there. So I went to the hangar. But what that brought was peace for me as well, too, because that same parking lot was the AMU that I worked in for 2 years as a first sergeant, taking care of F-16, F-22, and F-35 maintainers. And I had the pleasure of signing off on the packages along with my commander to send some of my best and brightest maintainers over to the Thunderbird Squadron. So it tied the personal connection back together. And with that is really getting out there and honoring and carrying the legacy of America's sons and daughters with us through that, alongside with my brother. And so I find a lot of hope and healing through physical activity. And there's just something about cycling for me is I don't ride or I don't listen to music when I generally work out. You know, if you're any fans of David Goggins, he doesn't do it as well too, because he says, what happens when the music stops? Are you going to be able to perform, or do you need the music to motivate you, to have that intrinsic motivation to keep pushing yourself? So I don't cycle with music, but it really gives me the attention, is I feel it. I know I sense myself with the wind in there, with the shifter. And then I can kind of get into this reflective state, is just getting on the road with the pedals going, the wind in the air. And I can kind of reflect on and set my intention on why I went out for that ride today. And I know you had the coach on here before about talking about your why. You know,
there's one more thing before we run out of time. So
go for it.
I need to have you speak some wisdom to the group, because you have the credibility to do so, but I also have the credibility to say what I'm seeing across branches. So I've worked with branches of service, different branches. I gave a talk at the Air Force Academy about a couple years ago, asked the whole audience, it was 2,000 cadets, how many of you have read Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe? And there were a handful of people that raised their hands. Now, I just published a book called Warrior, and it is kind of an extension of the concept of what tribe means into the area of suicide prevention, mental health stigma, how do we create a group? But what I've noticed is that relative to some of the other branches of the Air Force or of the military, the Air Force tends to, I'm just generalizing here, have a more individualistic culture where people are really looking out for what their next promotion is. And so I just want to speak bluntly about that because I think it does become a limiting factor in terms of growth and our ability to take a knee when we need to, if we're worried about our public, image or perception, as opposed to forming a cohesive tribe or core unit with other people and living in a sort of interdependent way. Feels like a protective factor that people in the Air Force sometimes don't benefit from. So I wanted you to speak to that and what your thoughts are on that relationship and how it relates to coming forward to get help when you need it.
No, I totally see that, Doc, and you hit it there in my time in that, especially when we changed the enlisted promotion system to the stratifications and the force distribution. It became a little bit cutthroat and competitive. Instead of cohesiveness, it was more competition on what can I do more to get that. And that's kind of a difficult challenge, and we've kind of gone that way. But I see it in when this pandemic went is, we created this whole Facebook group, this Air Force Quarantine University, and there's like this pressure to do something with this so-called extra time that we have because of our missions that have been shown down. And there's always this pressure, and I know it's built into the enlisted force structure. It's like we should always be continuing to develop and everything like that. But maybe the right thing is to kind of slow down and connect with yourself. Is like, what is the right professional development? And I think there's a little bit of guilt tripping in that. It's like, it's always the chase. It's the carrot and the stick. It's like, what do I need to do to get ahead and everything like that. I remember going in and as a first sergeant speaking to first term airman center classes. The questions I would get out of there from FTAC like really kind of set me back. It wasn't about how do I become the best airman? How do I get my 5 level? How do I do this? Like, I'd get questions, how do I make senior airman below the zone? I'm like, you're not even in airman first class yet. And you're asking me about promotion to senior airman below the zone. So as they say in the soft world, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Maybe we need to slow down a little bit, bloom when you're planted. I know the cliche with that is like, be the best airman first class you can be. Be the best senior airman that you can be. Become that technical expert in there. Be comfortable with it. I get it. More money and more responsibility is great. But then for some of us out there, hey, we still like being the technicians, as a staff sergeant. That's the last time I really touched any equipment. So, be satisfied with being a staff sergeant. Be satisfied with, how you made it that far. You're a non-commissioned officer in the Air Force. That's a huge deal. So let's bring it back and bring back the importance of being where you're at right now versus what you're chasing, because you will always chase the carrot and the stick. And trust me, that chase can burn you out. All right.
What about coming
chasing
forward
that? Say
help?
again.
What about coming forward for help when you need it? When you realize that you're getting burned out or you're getting into that red zone, can you speak to that? Because you've done so much good work around that as well. Stigma and.
Yeah, I think we're kind of getting there. I mean, the resilience tactical pause was done fairly well. That started an open discussion, and to kind of show that we can be there, we can have these open discussions. That's why you're seeing a lot of these units. I don't know if you're a benefactor of the True North program or if some of you may have an MFLAC embedded into your unit. So there's the quality of that, and it's okay. It's okay for airmen to speak up and discuss from that. But we need our senior leaders to talk about their struggles as well too. Like with that is it can't always just be the voice of the airman. Like I want to hear the voice of the chief out there. This is why I think Enlisted Jesus does so well, because he's so transparent about what he talks about. He's not afraid to throw that on the table. Retired Chief Master Sergeant there, Todd Simmons was another good one, and now you got a good one down at AETC and Chief Joanne Bass. That, they're not afraid to share their struggles of what they're going through. So as commanders and first sergeants and chiefs out there, I implore you to, or even, senior officers, I implore you to tell about the struggles, because you know what? Living in the fishbowl, I've been in that fishbowl. You still struggle in the fishbowl. That water gets hot sometimes, and you know what? You may not be swimming long enough. because as soon as you get in there, more people are looking at you, and they're going to rely on you to be that kind of rock of that strength. And, if you can't, like, you got to take care of yourself. Otherwise you can't take care of the airmen. And the airmen, you need to rely on us, but we're all human. We all got our struggles. So maybe use this time right now to connect with yourself. Work on these things that you've been struggling with. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to push back on a tasking that seems unrealistic. Just have those real and honest conversations. And there's resources out there to do it. We just kind of, I'm going to be blunt here since I'm retired, is we're a little bit too passive with our resource sharing. Here's a card, call the MFLAC, call Military One Source. Instead of having that active listening and that honest conversation with our people, we just want to pass the buck and give them the resource. Or you hit the first sergeant easy button because you think the shirt's just going to handle it. And trust me, we're going to handle it. But you know what? I was the first sergeant. I wasn't the only sergeant. So I'm going to make y'all handle it as well too. And that's going to develop you as leaders. So what I'm saying is, let's not get off with this passive resourcing. Let's be engaged with our leadership. Let's find these resources that may not be internal. I found a lot of success, and I talk publicly about this, is we tend to do this thing to where we want to solve an inside the wire solution without using outside the wire resources, to put it in a combat environment. We're not using the indigenous public out there that may have some more experience in grief and trauma and mental health than our own internal stuff. And so maybe, learning some lessons from the soft world is finding that somebody in that local populace that knows the lay of the land. The solution may not be better, and it creates this nice harmonious relationship.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get to, Chris. That's what I was trying to have you say, because I think you have the credibility to say that. And you said that even before you were retired. The myth of invulnerability is what it ends up killing people. Some of our strongest leaders is that myth of an invulnerability. I have worked with military leaders who have died by suicide and nobody saw it coming, or have had other situations because they did not feel like they could take a knee or say, hey, I'm not okay. And so there's this invisible pressure that descends on you when you have a leadership role. But I think flipping that on its head and realizing that your courage and coming forward and saying, I'm going to take a space, or I'm going to go slower for right now, or get some help with this, gives people permission that you are taking care of, that they can do the same. And if you don't do that, then there's a cost to that, in that people will veer toward the side of conformity to not coming forward, and that puts people at risk. So that is kind of the last point on my punch list that I really want to make sure we got to in this leadership forum. Andrea or Aaron or Senior Master Sergeant, are there any questions or thoughts that you wanted to ask either Master Sergeant Joachimic or myself?
So you guys brought up some great stuff, but there is one thing that I wanted to chime in on: the passive resourcing. That's a huge foul that we've all seen happen. And one of the big things, I have a couple examples of it, but I was given the email, hey, here's our new, sexual assault hotline number. Hand this out to your folks. I'm like, well, let me check this number before I post this.
Okay.
Dial the number.
Yeah.
And it's, if you'd like to enter to win a cruise, put your credit card info in now.
Ooh.
This can't be right. Well, let me try it again. Same thing. Somebody had transposed the last two numbers of the phone number, and then they blasted it out to all hands. Now, this was at another DoD agency, but that kind of stuff. So if I would have just taken that number and just said, oh, you got problems? Here's your card. That person on their worst day could have called a number that would have gotten them something asking for their credit card info. So as leaders, as mentors, as wingmen, you got to look at cradle to grave. Own it. If you know somebody's got a problem, what are you doing to help them? Check those resources, make sure they're good to go, that you've got good tools in your toolbox, because you never know when somebody's going to need it. It's too late to wait till the thing's happening to check that stuff sometimes.
Yep.
So look at it ahead of time, walk them through it, make sure they understand, hey, if you call this number, they're going to ask you some questions. They're going to ask, are you DOD? Are you a reservist? Call some of those things and find out, so that when you do need to help somebody, you're better prepared and you can empathize with what they're going to go through when they use those resources.
Yeah, and if you can say, you know, I've called this number and I trust these folks to respond, and let's do this together. It's a whole different level of support. Now, you don't have to stay on the phone the whole time, but if you just get it started, then they feel surrounded by support, not just passed off or shuffled off, which is what I think we often do, you know, when people transition out and they come into the VA, there's kind of like this feeling of people are just kind of passed along. That's an excellent point.
Hey, Doc, I want to talk on that. So here's my experience with the VA as I transition out of the Air Force. It's kind of a funny thing. So they've got this new program. It's called the In Transition. But like they'll call me like 3 or 4 times, and then they blast me with like 27 emails about different subjects. So I don't feel welcomed because I get a phone call and I get an email blast of 27 different things, and it just kind of fills up my inbox. Like, what if I was working on something important? You know, that's my personal inbox there. And then now I've got to sift through 27 emails of stuff that may not apply to me and go with that. I mean, it's better than what it was. It is. I would tell some of you out there, if you're thinking about transitioning or like that, is like utilize some of these DoD skill bridge programs that are there, like that kind of like take some of the difficulty out of it. But I will tell you, and you know, Doc's a transition expert as well too, with in some of the work that she's worked on. But here's the thing: if you're setting up for transition, it's not just about employment either, and that's kind of where we go in a foul with that as well too. Talking about a passive resource is when we go to TAP, you know, they only prepare you for one thing, and that's to create a resume. They don't prepare you for the emotional, psychological, and the physical change of transition as well too, like some of you trainees are about to experience as you go to basic military training as well too.
So you're both outstanding resources, and we're blessed to have both of you online right now with everybody. So what I'd like to do is open it up. If anybody has some questions, use the raise a hand function or wave at the camera, you know, and then we'll have you call them out by name, and then they can unmute their mic and ask a question of you.
While we're waiting for people to jump in, just wanted to mention that tomorrow morning, Military Times is going to publish the foreword for the book I just wrote called Warrior, How to Support Those Who Protect Us. And, you know, I'm here. I live about 45 minutes from Travis. There's a very generous group of veterans that bought several hundred copies of my book to distribute in California. And so I'm sending boxes of 24, 48 books. And I gave up my author profits to do this, so I'm not making any money off this. But let me know if you want to collect it together into one group. If I could send, you know, up to 48 books to people that really want to dive into that, I would be happy to support that. And the foreword is going to be published tomorrow in Military Times if you want to check it out.
Doctor, this is Airman Valentin. I just had a question for you. You said it's called Warrior, How to Support Those Who Protect Us?
Yes, that's right.
And then what was the title? That was actually what I was going to ask you, so thank you. But what was the title of the other book that you mentioned? You said this is kind of...
The other book I mentioned was the one that I wrote with Jason Roncaroni called Beyond the Military, A Leader's Guide for Warrior Reintegration, or a Leader's Handbook for Warrior Reintegration. They're both on Amazon. Amazon has had trouble stocking Warrior. They keep going out of stock. It's so frustrating. So I've got deals with Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and Walmart to get that one out. And Beyond the Military was published in 2019. You can look at our reviews, you know, online and what it's about, but it's basically about 400 pages. And people told us, you know, sell this as a program. It's an integrative program of transition that takes you through exercises. Jason is a coach, so he decided he's going to give away everything that he uses as a coach to help people through transition. And the whole thing is about what Chris was talking about, not the job. It's not your resume. It's about the psychological and identity crisis. And then I wrote 80 pages of that about relationship transition, because that's another area that nobody hits. And it was a huge issue for so many of my patients that they would have a relationship breakup or get into a relationship that, you know, crashed and burned and caused a lot of chaos in their lives, because it's a very vulnerable time for people and for relationships when your life is thrown into a blender. And so it's almost like 2 books in one. And, you know, we'll probably make a couple dollars off every sale, but we priced it for $30 because we wanted to have impact and change the way that we support those in transition. So that's the name of the other one if you want to check it out.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Looks like we have another question. Chris, are you technically skilled? Can you?
I'm trying to sift through to see where it may be at. I'm like,
is that Andrea Bold?
Let's go with Senior Airman Palacios. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey there. So I'm Senior Airman Palacios. So we have a lot of trainees online right now with us, and you guys have mentioned a lot about the transition out of the military. What do you recommend for them as a transition into the military life?
I have thoughts, but Chris, I'm going to put that to you first. Given that you
be ready. I will tell you, I got some friends who are MTIs down there, and they're going to get you in the shape, and they're going to be there. A lot of it's going to become it's a mental game. Okay, once you get in there, it's for these weeks. It's a mental game. Is they're going to trick you, and what's going to happen there as well too. Like PT, hey, stay on it. It's going to be weird in this era of social, not social distancing. I hate that term. It's physical distancing because we want to socially connect. But PT is going to look funny. So what you're going to have there is think about this. Think about any point in your life where you made this large transition. You're becoming your former self. Is the shell is kind of coming off, and we're asking you to assimilate into it. The big things is really understanding the rules and regulations of the Air Force, and getting on there is understanding this is just the baseline. They're going to tell you, this is the history, this is this. It's just kind of stay attuned to that. But I would say the thing to stay most there is to how to function as a team. Because some of you may come on after this and you may be weapons to where you're always working in a 3-person crew for lifts for weapons. Or you may be a crew chief out there that you have to do launch or recovery on, name an aircraft. Or you're in the hospital and you're doing patient safety calls and everything. So the biggest lesson in there is, how to take care of each other as a team. Don't worry if your 341 is going to get pulled because your hair or your hospital corner wasn't made the right way. It's going to happen. All right. It's a game to make you better. Yep. So, and with that is focus on that. Learn and be a sponge as much as you can. Gather that. Enjoy the experience, whether you're at Keesler or you're at Lackland. And then also, as you make that transition in the technical training will be different as well too, to where you're going to get quite into the core of your job. I will tell you, pay attention and do as much as you can there, because airmen nowadays, you coming back as a senior airman, or you coming back as an A1C, you have more responsibility than I ever did. When I was a young A1C, like we're expecting you to do so much right out the gate. And the more you know, the better you know. But here's what I want to leave you with on that. Don't be afraid to make a mistake when you come back as well too. And I'm not talking about like breaking the law, like Article 15 type stuff. That's not a mistake. A mistake is like you failed, like you didn't follow the technical order the correct way and something got messed up on there. You don't remember. Ask the questions when you come back from this to really be like, you're in this learning process for at least, the next 2 to 3 years until you're really like, okay, this is where I fit in. I know my job. So be patient with yourself. You're not going to get everything correct out of the gate.
Yeah, there's 2 things I would kind of accentuate or add to that there's a huge difference between the people I've worked with that come into the military just kind of blindly not knowing what the next phase is going to look like, especially in terms of the mental aspect of it. Yeah. And the people that have a mentor that gives them not just a briefing, but like a really detailed and comprehensive understanding of the mental aspect of that transition. I would say you should aggressively pursue mentorship before you go into the next phase so that you can understand and have a framework for why failure is part of this and it's okay, and you're going to have to get yourself back up. I see people sometimes as well have a kind of perfectionist mindset and set these expectations for themselves. And this is the second point, is not realizing that how you handle failure is the game. You know, it is the game. They will set you up to fail in ways that will help grow you. And so learning how to be comfortable with failure and not stay stuck there, but to take it, learn from it, move on, that is part of the mental game. And so that's what I would add to that question.
Good question. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, thank you.
I see another hand up from Trainee Mendez as well, too.
Hi, Trainee Mendez reports as ordered. I have a question towards Chris. Basically, I'm like the first member of my family that has decided to serve our country, and they're not really supportive about that decision. Have you ever experienced anything like that? Like, how do you make yourself feel better? Because sometimes I feel kind of sad. Like, they don't support me. They're like, they don't want me to go along with it and stuff like that. Like, have you ever experienced that?
I have several times. Is how, you know, one, as a first sergeant, always, airman, call your mom. Okay, please call your mom. All right. I get a lot of that, but and that's the difficulties in it is you know what, that this is your decision to make, and that's a hard follow, and it does hurt when you don't feel supported by your family members. And thank you for being the first of your family and the first of your generation to serve this great nation here. That's a difficult conversation to have. I had a few, and a lot of them was it was not because they didn't want you to serve. It was because of some political beliefs, or they don't want you serving under a certain leader. I've seen that. And I've also been like, okay, well, and they've been real derogatory towards, you know, just service, and it doesn't get you anywhere. And I would say the opposite is, my advice to you is go out there and knock it out the park, and to show them how impressive you are as a human being and how proud you're going to make your family by serving. Like, you're going to go in and you're going to be the best member of your family in this generation, because you're doing something that less than 1% of Americans is doing. Is you're making that initial sacrifice and say, hey, look, you know, I'm going to go out there and use that as fuel and motivation to prove them wrong. My dad was kind of one of those examples. He thought I was only going to serve 4 years, be done, go to college and get out. Well, here I am 20 years later as a retiree. I'm like, you know what? And now my dad looks back on me. He's like, I'm proud of you. Look what you made of yourself. Like, look what you're doing now. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity if I wouldn't have stepped into that recruiter's office and said, hey, let's go with this. I don't want to be the same as all my friends here at school. Let me go off and join the Air Force. And it really set my life apart.
All right, team. I know we can sit here all day asking questions. We got some great folks here. We do need to start our transition, but definitely thank you for allowing us to be a part of your dash today. It's been an honor. You know, you've helped all of our folks here. Hopefully everybody out there, you know, they're going to make their dash, you know, even better now with some of the guidance, some of the tutelage that y'all have provided here today. So thank you very much again from the 349th Air Mobility Wing.
Thank you.
All right, team. We're going to do a 5-minute break, get back on our timeline, and then we're going to have our next one is going to be Senior Master Sergeant Esquire is going to be coming up. So go ahead, don't log off. You can stop your video, mute your mics, and then we'll see you in 5.